All right, buckle up, because today we're taking a wild ride all the way back to the very beginning. And I mean the very beginning. We're talking about a time so ancient, so far removed from anything we know today, that it almost feels like a different planet. But here's the thing. It wasn't another planet. It was right here on Earth. It was the land between two rivers, the land where everything started, the land the ancient Greeks would one day call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Now, does that ring a bell? Does it give you that tingle like you're standing on the edge of something massive? Because it should, my friend. It really should. We're talking about ancient Sumer, the world's first urban civilization, the cradle of writing, of law, of religion, of trade. The place where human beings first looked at the chaos around them and said, you know what? We can do way better than this. And they did. So here's the real question. And I want you to sit with this for a second. How does a group of people living in the middle of a hot, flat, dusty floodplain in what is now southern Iraq manage to build the entire foundation of what we call civilization? How do you go from wandering the wilderness to constructing massive temples that reach up towards the heavens? How do you invent writing out of thin air with nobody around to teach you how? Now that is what you call pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. That's the Sumerian way, and we're about to break it all down, from the very first cities all the way to the fall of a world that once held everything together. Let's dig in. Before we talk about the people, we gotta talk about the land. Because in ancient history, geography isn't just background noise, it's destiny. Picture this, it's around 4000 BC. The world is raw, untamed, and enormous. Forests stretch for hundreds of miles. Rivers run wild and unpredictable. Most of humanity is still scattered across the landscape in small bands, hunting game and gathering whatever they can find. But down in the south of Mesopotamia, in what archaeologists call the alluvial plain, something different is happening. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers deposit thick, rich layers of silt every time they flood. And that silt, that dark, wet, incredibly fertile mud, that's basically nature handing you a gift with a bow on top. You plant a seed in that soil, and the thing practically jumps out of the ground. Barley, wheat, emmer, crops shoot up faster than you can harvest them. The land is so productive that small farming communities start feeding way more people than they actually need to. And when you've got a surplus, when you've got more food than you can eat, something extraordinary starts to happen. People start doing other things. Suddenly you don't need every single person out in the fields from sunrise to sunset. Some folks can be potters, some can be weavers, some can be traders, and some can start thinking about bigger things, like organizing, like building, like leading. This is the spark, right here. This is where the fire starts. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, but fertile land alone doesn't make a civilization. And you'd be absolutely right. Because the other side of this coin is brutal. The south of Mesopotamia had no stone for building, no timber for construction. The floods were unpredictable, sometimes catastrophic. The summer heat was punishing, and the rivers could shift course without a single warning. So the Sumerians were caught in this fascinating tension. Extraordinary abundance on one hand, and brutal environmental challenges on the other. What do humans do when the environment throws everything it's got at them? They adapt, they organize, they cooperate. And that cooperation, that need to work together, to plan together, to store food together, to manage water together, is the seed of what we call civilization. Does that give you chills? Because it should. The very challenges that could have wiped them out ended up being the rocket fuel that launched them forward. You simply cannot make this stuff up. Now, the Sumerians didn't just show up one day with a fully formed civilization ready to roll. It doesn't work like that. Before the Sumerians, there was the Ubaid culture, a group of people who had been farming and settling in southern Mesopotamia since roughly 5500 BC. The Ubaid people were the true pioneers. These folks were laying down the groundwork long before anyone showed up to get the credit. They built the first large mud brick structures in the region. They developed sophisticated pottery with elegant painted geometric designs. And here's the kicker. They established the first permanent settlements at sites that would later become some of the most legendary cities in all of human history. Eridu, Ur, Uruk. Think of the Ubaid people as the folks who cleared the land, dug the foundation, and poured the concrete. They didn't build the skyscraper, but without them, there is no skyscraper. Period. And then, somewhere around 3800 to 3500 BC, a shift happens. Archaeologists can see it in the record. New pottery styles, new architectural techniques, a new cultural energy surging through the region. Whether the Sumerians were a completely new group who migrated into Mesopotamia, or whether they evolved in place from the Ubaid population, is still one of the great unsolved debates of ancient history. What we do know is this. By around 3500 BC, the Sumerians are here, and they are ready to change the world. Nobody handed them a manual. Nobody told them it was possible. They just went ahead and did it anyway. And honestly, respect. Let me paint you a picture. It's around 3500 BC. You're standing outside the walls of Uruk, the world's first true city, and this place is absolutely something else. The walls of Uruk stretch for miles. Inside those walls, tens of thousands of people are living, working, trading, arguing, praying, and doing all the messy, glorious, complicated things that human beings do when packed together. Some estimates put Uruk's population at its peak somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 people in 3500 BC. Let that sink in for a second. There was nowhere else on Earth remotely like this. Not even close. At the center of the city rises a massive mud brick platform called the Anu Ziggurat, and sitting on top of it is the White Temple, a gleaming lime-plastered structure dedicated to Anu, the sky god. This isn't just a building. This is a declaration. This is the Sumerians looking up at the sky and saying, "We are here. We matter. And we built something that proves it." The city has specialized craftspeople producing goods, pottery, metalwork, textiles, jewelry, at a scale never seen before in human history. There are merchants running trade networks that stretch hundreds of miles in every direction. And there are administrators, the world's first bureaucrats, keeping track of who owns what, who owes what, who dropped off how many jars of barley last Tuesday. And now here's where things get really spicy. How do you keep track of all of that? How do you remember a trade that happened 6 months ago? How do you communicate with someone who lives 3 cities away without being physically present? You write it down. And that, my friend, is how writing was born. Right here, in this ancient, dusty, magnificent city. Can we just stop for a second and genuinely appreciate how absolutely mind-blowing this is? Before writing, the only way to pass information was through speech or memory. You had to physically be there. You had to remember everything. And human memory, as brilliant as it is, has its limits. You cannot remember 10,000 grain transactions spread across an entire year. Nobody can. So the Sumerians did what all clever people do when they hit a wall. They found a workaround. Around 3200 BC, temple administrators in Uruk started pressing simple pictographic symbols into soft clay tablets using a reed stylus. A jar with lines meant a certain amount of grain. A specific mark meant a specific temple or person. Over time, those pictograms evolved. They became more abstract. They started representing sounds instead of just objects. And just like that, slowly over centuries, you've got a full writing system. The Sumerians called it cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, because of the distinctive wedge-shaped marks left by the stylus. And cuneiform doesn't just record grain transactions, it records everything: laws, prayers, hymns, stories, the inner lives of human beings, scratched into clay and preserved across thousands of years. Does that not just blow your mind? Somewhere out there in a museum right now, There are clay tablets with somebody's actual grocery list from 5,000 years ago, written by a real person who woke up one morning and said, "I need to remember to pick up barley on the way home." That person is more relatable than half the people you know, and their words have outlasted entire empires. Now that is what you call leaving a mark. Now let's talk about something that is absolutely central to everything the Sumerians built: religion. And look, I'm not just talking about rituals and prayers. I'm talking about a belief system so woven into daily life, so embedded in the structure of the city itself, that you literally cannot separate the sacred from the secular. Because in Sumer, they weren't two different things. They were the same thing. The Sumerians believed that human beings were created for one purpose: to serve the gods. Full stop. The gods, and there were hundreds of them, controlled everything: the weather, the floods, the harvest, the stars, birth, fate, the whole package. And who managed that relationship between humans and gods? The priests. And where did the priests do their work? In the ziggurat, that massive stepped pyramid structure that has come to define Sumerian architecture in the popular imagination. It was literally the house of the god. The deity didn't just get worshipped there, the deity lived there. And the temple wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was an economic powerhouse. The temple owned land. The temple employed workers. The temple stored grain and redistributed it to the community. The Sumerians basically invented the corporation, thousands of years before anyone else even thought of it. And their gods? Fascinating doesn't even cover it. You've got Anu, the great sky god; Enlil, the god of wind and storms, arguably the most powerful deity in the Sumerian world, someone you really did not want to get on the wrong side of. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, clever, cunning, occasionally mischievous. And Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, one of the most complex and compelling figures in all of ancient mythology. These gods weren't distant, abstract concepts. They had personalities. They argued with each other. They made deals. They got jealous and angry and generous and petty. Reading Sumerian myths, you get the very clear feeling that these gods are essentially humans with superpowers. Which makes sense because they were created by humans trying to explain a world that was constantly overwhelming them. And speaking of stories, here's something that might just stop you cold. Long before the Bible was written, the Sumerians had their own version of the Great Flood story. In the Epic of Atrahasis and other Sumerian texts, we find the story of a great flood sent by the gods to wipe out humanity. A single righteous man is warned ahead of time and instructed to build a massive vessel capable of carrying animals and his family to safety. The flood comes, destroys everything. The man and his boat survive. The waters recede. Life begins again. Does that give you goosebumps? Because it should. What it suggests is something deeply interesting. That memory of a real, catastrophic, ancient flood event may have been passed down through oral tradition across thousands of years and multiple cultures, each retelling it in their own way. Think about that the next time someone tells you ancient history has nothing to do with the present. Now let's talk politics. Because here's the thing about Sumer. It was never really one unified nation the way we think of countries today. What it was a collection of city-states. Each major Sumerian city, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Kish, Umma, was essentially its own independent political entity. Each had its own patron deity, its own king, its own army, its own laws. They shared a common language and broadly similar religious beliefs, but they were fiercely, sometimes violently, competitive with each other. And here's something that'll make you nod your head slowly. The Sumerians were the first people to have a written record of political alliances, border disputes, diplomatic negotiations, trade agreements, and outright wars between city-states. The very first drama in recorded human history wasn't a love story. It was a territorial border dispute between two cities arguing over who owned a canal. Human nature am I right? The political system was centered on the king, known in Sumerian as the Lugal, literally big man. Early on, the high priest was likely the most powerful figure in the city. But as military competition between cities intensified, the role of the warrior king became increasingly dominant. Power shifted from those who controlled sacred knowledge to those who controlled organized force. Honestly, you could write a whole book on that one idea alone. And many people have. Now let's talk about what it was actually like to live in ancient Sumer day to day. Most Sumerians lived in mud brick houses, small, clustered together along narrow, winding streets. The typical home had a central courtyard open to the sky, with rooms arranged around it. Cooking was done in the courtyard. It was compact, warm, and very much a communal existence. The diet was remarkably consistent: bread and beer. Those were the two staples of life in ancient Sumer, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that beer was basically the water of the ancient world. It was safer than raw river water, it was calorie-dense, and it was produced in enormous quantities by the temple breweries. Workers got paid in bread and beer rations. We have actual tablets recording ration lists, X number of loaves, and Y jugs of beer per worker per day. This is not mythology. This is the world's first paycheck. In beer. Now, if that doesn't make ancient Sumer sound like a pretty solid place to work, I don't know what will. The Sumerians also had a sophisticated legal system. They kept detailed records of contracts, property transfers, marriages, divorces, and business disputes. They had courts. They had judges. Women in Sumer had more rights than in many later ancient societies. They could own property. They could run businesses. They could appear in court. High-ranking priestesses wielded significant religious and social power. And speaking of that, can we talk about Enheduanna for a second? Because this woman deserves way more recognition than she gets. Daughter of Sargon of Akkad, High Priestess of the Moon, god Nanna at Ur. And, brace yourself, the world's first named author in human history. Around 2285 BC, Enheduanna composed a series of hymns to the goddess Inanna that are so powerful, so emotionally complex, so poetically sophisticated that scholars today are still writing papers about them. She was the first human being in recorded history to sign her name to a creative work and say, "I wrote this. This is mine." Every writer, every poet, every content creator alive today is standing in the long shadow cast by a Sumerian priestess who lived 4,300 years ago. Think about that the next time you put your name on something you created. Around 2334 BC, someone came along who was going to shake the entire Sumerian world to its foundations. His name was Sargon of Akkad. Sargon was not Sumerian. He was Akkadian, a Semitic-speaking people who had been living alongside the Sumerians for centuries. And this man, through military genius, political savvy, and what seems like a supernatural level of ambition, managed to do something nobody had ever done before. He conquered all of Sumer and unified the region under a single empire. The world's first true empire was born. Sargon's origin story is itself the stuff of legend. According to ancient texts, he was of humble birth, possibly placed as an infant in a basket in the river by his mother. A gardener found him and raised him. He rose through the ranks before launching his campaigns of conquest. Sound familiar? The Sumerians and Akkadians were telling that basket in the river story long before it appeared anywhere else. Sargon didn't just conquer Sumer, he celebrated it, absorbed it, adopted its culture, and used its writing system to run his empire. It's a classic case of a military conqueror falling in love with the culture they conquered. The Akkadian Empire lasted about 180 years before internal rebellions, drought, and pressure from outside groups brought it crashing down around 2154 BC. And what rose from the ruins? The Sumerians, resilient as ever. Around 2112 BC, a king from the city of Ur named Ur-Nammu managed to reunite southern Mesopotamia and establish what historians call the Third Dynasty of Ur. This period is sometimes called the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance, and that name is absolutely earned. Massive ziggurats were constructed across the land. The administration was extraordinarily sophisticated. And Ur-Nammu gave the world the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest known written law code in human history, predating even the famous Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. The Sumerians wrote the first laws. Everything that comes after, every legal system, every code of rights, every court of law, has some debt to those scribes pressing cuneiform into clay tablets in the city of Ur 4,000 years ago. But all good things, even civilizations, come to an end. Around 2004 BC, the city of Ur fell to the Elamites from what is now Iran. Ancient Sumerian texts, specifically a set of laments known as the Lamentations over the destruction of Ur, describe the fall of the city in devastating emotional detail. Temples abandoned, sacred objects looted, a proud civilization brought to its knees. But the fall of Ur was just the most dramatic moment in a longer, slower decline. Climate change played a significant role. Around 2200 BC, a prolonged drought struck the entire region, causing agricultural failures and social instability. Soil salinization was another slow disaster. Centuries of intensive irrigation gradually caused salt to accumulate in the soil, and fields that once produced abundant crops started failing. And the Amorites, semi-nomadic peoples from the west, had been filtering into Mesopotamia for generations, gradually taking political control of many Sumerian cities. It wasn't a single dramatic collapse. It was more like a slow tide going out. Each decade a little more water receding, until one morning you wake up and realize the ocean you knew is simply gone. Sumerian as a spoken language gradually died out, replaced by Akkadian in everyday life. But like Latin in medieval Europe, Sumerian survived as a prestigious language of religion and scholarship for centuries after it ceased to be anyone's mother tongue. Scribes studied it. Priests used it in rituals. It was the first dead language that people deliberately kept alive because of its cultural weight. So here's the question I want to leave you with. When a civilization falls, when its cities crumble and its language fades and its people are absorbed into new empires, does it really disappear? Look around you. The 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle? Sumerian. The concept of written law? Sumerian. The first stories ever committed to writing? Sumerian. Beer as a commercial product? Sumerian. The school as an institution for formal education? Sumerian. The first love poems? Sumerian. The Babylonians who came after them stood on Sumerian shoulders. The Assyrians built on their legacy. The Persians inherited their astronomy. The Greeks drank from the same deep well of Mesopotamian wisdom. And through the Greeks, that knowledge flowed into Rome, into the Islamic Golden Age, into the European Renaissance, and eventually into the modern world you and I are navigating right now. Every time you look at a clock and see the number 60, a Sumerian mathematician is whispering in your ear. Every time a lawyer cites a legal precedent, they're working within a framework first outlined on clay tablets in the city of Ur. Every time someone writes a story, any story, they are participating in a tradition begun by a people who pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay and said, "This matters. This should be remembered." And they were right. The Sumerians had no one to look to, no role models, no blueprint, no civilization before them that had done what they were trying to do. They were building the airplane while they were already in the air, and they pulled it off. They built the first cities. They invented writing. They wrote the first laws. They told the first stories. They looked up at the stars and decided those lights in the sky had meaning worth recording. They organized their society, managed their economy, debated their politics, prayed to their gods, loved their families, brewed their beer, and scratched their ideas into clay with the conviction that someone, somewhere, someday, would find those tablets and understand. We found them. We understand. And across 6,000 years of silence, these people are still talking to us. still teaching us, still reminding us that the desire to build something that lasts, something bigger than yourself, is not a modern impulse. It's the oldest impulse there is. That's the story of ancient Sumer, from the first cities to the fall, from the mud of the Euphrates to the foundations of the modern world. And if that doesn't hit different, I genuinely don't know what will. Stay curious, stay sharp, and I'll catch you in the next one.